back to this live session for the course of the psychology of language, and I'm here to probably take up some questions or some suggestions and feedbacks which you have for the course. Let me first introduce you to the course a little bit. So, and before that I'll introduce a little bit about myself. I am Naveen Kashyap. I work with IIT Guwahati. I'm a cognitive psychologist by profession, and my main area of work is in sleep and cognition. So, I directly don't teach language, but I thought it would be a good idea to float a course on psychology of language, look at the psychological principles, and that's why we had this course going. What my aim with this course was to introduce you to those psychological principles which come into language and give you more detailed output about psycholinguistics. So, to start with, I am not a linguist, but as I have been introducing in the course, the psychological aspects of language. So, how did I formulate this course? The course started by first introducing how animals and humans communicate and what is the difference between these two type of organisms. So, how does language develop for that matter? That was what we started off, and this is what we call the introduction part. And the next part was looking at the science of language. So, basically how experiments are done, particularly in language and more specifically in any behavioral sciences. So, I introduced to you the basic concepts of how experimentation is done, or any kind of experiment is set up in language or any other behavioral sciences. In detail, we looked at ERP results and how to do ERP experiments in language and behavioral experiments in language. Then we moved to the basic processes in language. So, we had two sections in it. We looked at how language is produced and how language is comprehended. These two sections, language production is more in terms of the vocal tract and vocal system, how language is produced, what is wave, how it is the production happens in terms of the voice box and different things in terms of the production of language. And then the comprehension of language in terms of how do we hear, what are basic waveforms, how is the human ear organized, and how do we hear language. So, that was what about hearing about language was, the basics of it. And then we switch gear into the advanced processes. So, I think a couple of lectures from the advanced process would be up. Words would be the last thing that you would have been studying, and then will come sentences, reading, writing, and bilingualism and those aspects. So, in advanced processes, we looked at what are words, what does it comprise of, what is the meaning of words, what does it represent, that kind of thing. We looked at how sentences are formed, we looked at how reading and writing is a part of language, and lastly we finished it with bilingualism. So, that was what the outline. I might be forgetting a couple of lectures here because I am not very thorough at this point of time, but then this is how the outline was. So, we divided the course into three modules: the basic, the introductory module, the basic module, and the advanced modules. And all throughout, what we were doing is we were looking at language from more of a psychological point of view rather than a linguistic point of view. So, what brain processes help in language development, and what social aspects of language development are like. So, how does a child learn language, and a little bit about how language is produced, it is comprehended, what is communication, how does it differ from the structured language that we have. We looked into a little bit of Chomsky's views about language, the continuity discontinuity theory. We looked at theories of language production, and so all these aspects are there in most of the lectures which is out there. You can refer to most of the lectures, and of course, there is a forum which you can put up all your questions, and I will be very happy to answer it. I have been answering questions from your side. And so, in this live session, what I thought the idea would be to take up some interesting insights that you have about the course, about any feedback that you have about the teaching style that I have. If you want some more information on certain aspects of language, or if you have experiment in design and you want some input from my side about what should be done in that, particular design about particular problem. I'm here to solve those problems. So in all, this is a very brief introduction about what the course was designed and what was the thought process before designing this course. Of course, there are other courses there's a brief power cut, so we're back again online. So as I said, the idea was in terms of looking at what different the problems you have and how can I help you with redesigning your problem. So that's another thing that I'm here to do. So I'm live here in the studios of IITG MOOCs, and if you have questions or suggestions or feedbacks or some explanations that you want, please put forward those and let me see if I can address them. So I can address them right here, right now, or I can address them in the forum. Please, if you have questions, do come forward. So what we did in the course was we started off by first comparing the basic of communication system. So what is the basic of any communication system, and why do animals communicate, that kind of a thing, and we looked at the basic reasons of animal communication and what is the features of any animal communication system. And then what we did was we took some idea from there and started discussing how human language is all about. So it has a paramedical structure starting from the phonemes to the morphemes to the word sentences, something related to duality of patterning, which explains how basic forms are used or basic structures are used in a way to form complex sentences. So that kind of a thing is what we saw is the speciality of human language. And then we focused a little bit on to how human language developed as such. So what is the way in human language developed, right from the Neanderthal man to the coming up of the new language, and evidences to it in terms of Searle and Pitgins, which are basic languages or very primitive languages which is out there. So that is what we introduced, and about a little bit what language. Mahesh, the question is, what is the role of psychology in communication? A lot of role of psychology in communication, because the way we communicate, humans communicate or animals communicate, there are two different ways. With humans, we have structured language systems or structured ways of communicating, but animals have unstructured way of communicating. For example, they use hollow phrases. Hollow phrases are expressing something in totality. So what we can do is we can basically say the sun is warm, this warm, that warm. We can give measures of it. But what animals can do is they can tell, they can express communication in terms of whether there is a danger or not. So the role of psychology is in terms of how these things are built, how language is perceived. And so if you are looking at the overall role of psychology, basically psychology is the study of human behavior, and so these behaviors are guided by psychological principles. For example, in terms of communication, the idea, look at the honeybee wingle, which is a form of communication with the honeybees. Now if you look at how honeybees actually tell, if some honeybee has found a hive, how do they tell it? They tell it by using two different principles. One is by moving up and down in the vertical position, which actually tells where the new form of the honey is, and in terms of movement in the horizontal axis, which tells you how far it is. So these two things are a basic expression or a behavior that the honeybee is doing, which other honeybees understand, and so these behaviors are what is understood. In terms of human, how we express ourselves or how we express our feelings is through language, and these expressions has to do with various brain regions or various psychological principles like memory, like attention, like perception. All those come about into adding in together and making the language or communication possible. How to deal with psychology of the learners for boosting them to learn language. Psychology of the learners for boosting them to learn language. So basically this question has to do with language learning, and so in most of the chapters, there is the second part of it. What we have dealt is how should this language learning be, or how could we promote this language learning. Now, the ways in which we can do it is we can make this in terms of language learning, we can make. So, whether you are learning primary language, first of all, the mother tongue is something that you learn by something called submersive inversion. So, here what happens is there are things that the children learn on their own. But if you are talking about the second language or learning a new language, there are ways of how learning it, and the best way that is possible is something called submersive inversion, which there is a software out there which is called Rosetta Stone, which also uses it. What it does is, instead of teaching the nouns or the content words, nouns, pronouns, adjectives, those kind of things, what they do is they show you a particular image or concept, and they make you learn this concept through the primary language. And so that is one way in which you can increase learning. The other way to influence the second language learning can be in terms of teaching the action words rather than teaching the nouns, because nouns are something which is very familiar or which is very easy to learn. Now, if you look at the memory, what really happens is, if you are looking at working memory, what really happens is, when we process a sentence, we actually look at the action words. So, if I am to tell you that Ram is going to the village, what actually the phonological loop or the working memory is trying to keep with it is the word Ram, is the word going, and is the word village. And so Ram and village is more or less like object and subject, and so since English follows this order of object and subject, so they have to be kept in a rule. But the connecting word is going. Think of yourself going into any foreign language land. Now, if you are there, the only word, the most important words that you need is something called content words or action words. For example, we say, waiter, come here. So, come here, go there, eat, drink, or any other thing is what is the initial word that you need to learn. And so, one way of teaching, or one way of teaching a new language has to do with learning of a content word and using something called submersive inversion that we have talked about. Here what we do is, instead of you learning the new language in the way in terms of spellings and in terms of words and in terms of grammar, what we tend to do is make the second language or things in the second language, concepts in the second language available to you in terms of the first language, in terms of pictures of the first language. That way language learning will be more easy and a better thing. Can we guess? So Sharadeep Patra has a question which says, can we guess anything about the person from the hand movement and the eyeball movement? Person from the hand movement and eyeball movement. So guess about the person, as in I'm not very sure what you are asking. Is it in terms of personality, or is it in terms of how they are reading speed? What exactly are you asking? So basically, in reading, what we tend to do is we learn to in reading we have something called saccades and fixations, and see, the saccades and fixations are basically eye movements. So by the movement of the eye, what best can be, if you be a little bit more clear on what question are you asking, I can give you a more better answer. And your second question is hearing most important during learning a new language? And it is yes, because when you learning a new language, makes you, or it involves you to learning new words. And word learning has, any word has two parts into it, a phonological form and a semantic form. So if you are able to spell the phonological form, you will be able to link this phonological form or the phonology of the word or the spelling of the word for that matter with the meaning of it. And so if the link is better, then in the mental lexicon itself, this word or this concept, because words are what these are meaningless without the concept. So every word has a spelling, semantic form and a phonological form. And when you are remembering also word, we tend to remember in terms of first the spelling and matching the spelling with the meaning. So yes, the language which you have, or the learning, listening of in a new language learning is important. Now reading skill, I was asking about reading skill in previous question. Reading skill, so the reading skill has to, there are two ways of, the two theories of reading. One is the I mind hypothesis. It's basically a form of cognitive psychology, from cognitive psychology. And so basically looking at the eyeball movement or how you are reading has nothing to do with comprehension. Sometimes you keep on reading very fast and the comprehension is different. So basically the way you read, or the way your hand movements are, and the way the comprehension happens, or the way you understand, are two different things into it. Because another factor into it will be attention. So basically reading, as I discussed before, has to do with saccades and fixations. And so there are tests which have been done in which the middle letters of sentence has been replaced and the first and last letters have been kept fixed, and even with that people have been able to read the whole sentences. So basically reading, this eyeball movement or reading has to do with the first and last letters, the saccades, which is the jumping of the eyeball from the first to the last letter, and then again from the first to last letter. That is how we read. And the fixation, which is the time that you spend on the first and the jumping between the first and the last letters of each word. So basically in terms of your eye movement and reading skill, as of now I am not aware of whether there is a link to it, whether there is eyeball movement has anything to do with hand movement and so on and so forth, but I'll definitely look into it. And if I find something, I'm going to post it into my forum, and I promise I'll look into this question of yours. So whether it's an interesting question, whether anybody can guess anything about person from the hand movement and eyeball movement. So I'll look into it and I'll get back to you onto the forum if there is anything interesting that I come about, or that is out there in research. Now with that, if you have other questions also, anything else that you feel is important, or any problem that you have been having, or any kind of let's say if you have an experiment and you want to discuss it, any other thing, I'm here to discuss. So as I was saying, what we were doing is in the second section itself of how this language course is, I was talking more about how experiments are designed in language. And so we're looking at how these hypotheses, how problems are generated, how these problems relate to specific hypotheses, how these hypotheses are tested. So basically using the inductive and deductive method. And so from hypothesis testing we have some data, and based on that data we make some kind of an observation, and based on that observation we test the hypothesis. If it works, if it doesn't work, based on that we change the hypothesis or we change the problem. So basically using the inductive and deductive method we keep on doing work in behavioral sciences and in language. So we design experiments, and so in designing experiments also we use so what is the reason for stammering? Stammering is basically problem with the language production area. So the language comprehension area, which you know is the Wernicke area, and the language production area is more of the Broca area. So when in stammering, the person has a comprehension, but due to some problems or due to some it could be a psychological problem, or it could be a physiological problem, generally physiological problem. What happens is the person knows the Wernicke area, which is comprehension, knows the word that you're going to speak, but you're not able to produce the actual phonology of it, and so that is one of the reason of stammering. So basically production, so if language production area is not developed, one thing, or it could be in terms of the fact that you are slow in production of a language, you're in generating vocabularies. That could be one of the reason, but there could be medical reasons for it, and I'm not sure what medical reasons are there about stammering, but that is one reason. So the basic problem happens because the connection between the production and the comprehension area is disturbed in some way. So the comprehension area feedbacks to the production area for producing the right sentence, but the production area cannot at points of time produce the actual the phonology of the sentence or words, and so there is stammering. But then as time passes, or with time, they come up with so it could be in terms of also producing or not able to produce certain syllables or certain phonological sounds. That could be another reason for stammering. So is there any website from which I can get hands-on experience which is related to the course directly? The Suradeep, what I will Shubhadeep, so I'm sorry, Subhadeep, what I'll suggest is we have put a couple of books. So instead of website, my suggestion would be to read books. One is by Carroll, the other is also there, and so look at these books on the psychology of language, or I'm not very sure about websites, but I will have a look into it, and if there are any interesting websites which can provide you some kind of link or some kind of more information about the course, I'll put into the forum for you. But as of for now, just look at the books that I have prescribed, and just go through the books, and they'll give you more information about what is there in the course and what the course has to offer. And so as I was saying, what we were doing in the second section is we were looking at how experiments are designed in basically language. So we looked at what is the experimental design, what kind of experimental design do we use, in within subject design, do we use, and between subject design, and that form of thing we looked at. We also looked at what kind of measures should be used. So we discussed about the electrophysiological measure. We also discussed about the behavioral measures of measuring, so reaction time, accuracy as dependent variables, and so in there I detailed about what is dependent variable, what is independent variable, and how these things work, and how these designs are really used for doing any kind of access about or any kind of research in language. Now the third section was in terms of comprehension of language, which is how do we hear, and so we started off by defining the basics of the hearing. So in terms of what is a wave, what is an amplitude, what is pitch, what is tone, what is loudness, those things we define, and then later on we define the inner structure of the human ear, which is how it is organized in terms of the cochlea, in terms of the basilar membrane, in terms of the basilar liquid which is out there, and how it is tonotopically organized. So tonotopical organization means that from higher frequencies to lower frequencies, so how sound waves are sent through this liquid into the basilar membrane, where you have hair cells which picks up the frequency of the movement of the liquid and then transmits it to something called the association cortex, which makes meaning out of it. So that is what we defined there in terms of the language comprehension. We looked at in detail a little bit about how comprehension happens in children, and how early hearing happens. So in the third trimester itself, children are able to hear, and that kind of thing. So how this motherese, which is basically speaking in a soft tone to children, how they improve, and several other factors that we discussed. So you will be able to look at the lecture and understand that. Fourthly, we went into the production of language. So we looked at the vocal cord, the system vocal cord. So we looked at how language is produced in terms of consonants, in terms of vowels. We looked at the production of vowels, how by vowels are produced by not blocking the air which is coming from the vocal tract, and how consonants are produced by blocking the output of the air at different places in the mouth, either in the mouth or at the upper ridge, the alveolar ridge, and so on and so forth. So we looked into that, and we also looked at how language production can be improved, or can be substantiated, or can be studied in smaller children. So that was the basic process, and then we switched gears and looked into advanced things, like we looked into what words are, and I think right now we just have the section on words which we have uploaded. So we looked at what are words, how words have a phonological meaning and a semantic meaning, and how these words are actually meaningless, but how they they attain meaning, and how words are actually related to concepts. You may tell me more about infant directed speech. So infant directed speech, or motherese, as you know, is a way of making the infant understand the vocal speech. So there is something called prosodic bootstrapping, through which the children understand where is the marker. If you know about speech, speech is continuous in nature. Just like writing, when you have words which are very different, and so there are spaces between words. But with the speech is more continuous, and so what happens is the consonants and vowels, they overlap with each other. So what with infant directed speech, what the mother actually does is she slows the speech streams, she slows the way a speech is delivered to the children, and making deliberate pauses. So these deliberate pauses then makes the children understand the word boundaries and perceive the word, and so that is what this infant directed speech is all about, motherese is all about. This is to make the children learn or where to make the boundaries in terms of understanding words or perceiving words and sentences and speech as such. That is what infant directed speech is all about. So as I was referring to words, so we looked at what words are, and we looked at how the meaning is generated, the symbol grounding problem, the Chinese room problem, that kind of things we looked at. We also looked at how words are arranged in the mental lexicon in terms of the semantic memory theory, and how it is activated through something called the spreading activation model, and we looked at how it is how do we retrieve words, how do we store words. These are the things that we did in terms of words. And then we move to sentences. So sentences is something which will sentences and reading and writing is something which we'll do in the next session. So this is in brief what we were doing all around in this particular course. So if an Indian parent adopt a Russian child, will the child able to learn the words by infant directed speech which is Indian? So yes, he would be, but it has to be very early in life. So once if an Indian parent adopts a Russian child who is above a certain age, so there are ages in which the children learn these speeches. So after say 3 years, it becomes a little bit difficult for them to do that. But if a small Russian child is taken in by an Indian parent, and through infant directed speech, the Russian child will be able to understand the different words or the different segmentation boundaries of the word, and through prosodic bootstrapping they will be able to understand or produce new words, comprehend new words, and later on produce new words. So yes, that's possible, but then you have to have the child very early on. If it is come out of age, if it's of certain age, then another method of learning the second language has to be there, because first language learning is something which is very early on, it sets up very early on, and as you know, by very by 3 to I think 2 to 3 years, I don't have the dates with me, but the children has learned almost most children would have learned almost 4,000 words, and after that word learning is difficult. So very early on it is possible, entirely possible for Indian parent to teach word boundaries or Indian speech to Russian children. That's possible. So that's what we have been doing in this course, and as I said, rest of the things in terms of sentences or in terms of as we grow old, why is it difficult to learn a new language as compared to a baby? Now that's a very interesting question. So babies don't have words or semantics or pre-arranged. So in very easy words, they don't have a mental lexicon prepared. So they are still learning, and the mental lexicon is being prepared, or new concepts are being added. So what happens is, then when the child in the very beginning, they don't have these new concepts, and so they learn a concept. For example, one thing is, how do they learn? There is something called the whole versus part understanding of a concept. So when you point to a dog, to a very small child, the child gets generally takes it that the whole dog is the whole dog means the whole dog itself. And when you point a tail and say the, and again point to the dog, they will understand that tail is also a dog, but later on they understand that tail is a part of the dog. So that's that way they are learning, and so they are learning new things, and the mental lexicon is very new, and so new words are arranged. Now as you grow old, what happens is that the first language mental lexicon is already there, and so to replace that or to make any new connections to that, what happens is that it becomes really difficult, because the moment you try to put new language, or the moment you try to force in new concepts, new semantics into the earlier language, what happens is that the connections are not made that properly. Now in for children, they're still in a learning phase, and new concepts or two concepts, bilingual concepts, can be arranged or can be learned. But as you grow old, the brain is no more developing, and so you of course can learn new languages or other languages also, but it takes a little bit more difficult time, because what happens is, when you try to extract, when you try to say a word in your mother language and a new language, both the forms of the language, in the first form which you have learned as a child, and the new language, both gets activated, and so both compete with each other. And so learning new language as you grow becomes difficult, is because there are pre-existing concepts which are there, and they are preferred more than the new language. But then if you do a lot of practice, what could happen is that you would be able to perfectly learn. That's what people tend to do. They learn new languages every day. We tend to learn new languages every day, but the teaching those languages has to start with something called action words, and then using submersive inversion and other different techniques of learning the new language. And this new technique has to be based entirely on the fact that you don't give them words or don't give them pronunciations of the new words. What you tend to do is take a word, an image of the word, and try to make them this new word learn in terms of the initial language that they have learned, and that will sufficiently increase the learning idea or the learning pace. So yes, short answer to your question is that it becomes really difficult for people to learn new languages when they get old, and the primary reason being that there is a competition between the initial mental lexicon or concepts which is there from the first language. They interfere with the learning of the new language, or they somehow block the learning of the new language. So that's what I think is the answer to your question. And so what is the scope of research in the area about how a baby learns its mother tongue? The scope of research would be in terms of how there are so you can basically do an electrophysiological study on this and look at how does the various brain areas or language areas, they play a role in terms of learning the new language, learning its mother tongue. And you can also do behavioral studies with it. So one is you can do electrophysiological studies. You can also use various techniques of learning the mother tongue. For example, one is pointing. So motherese is one way of teaching. The other way of teaching new language could be in terms of showing them and not naming the object. And so different ways are there. I am pretty sure there are different kind of research papers, but the top thing that comes to my mind is you can basically design an ERP study, an EEG study, and look at the effect of duration, or the effect of maybe time, or stimulus variations, or you can look at some other effects and look at how these timing of these generate different ERPs, or how the brain is responding to these different changes which is happening in the study of new language. And so that comes to my mind. Whispering concept, I'm not very sure what this is, but I'll get back to you, Gulshan Kumar, on the whispering concept, because I'm not aware of this whispering concept. So one idea could be that this whispering, when we are not, so there is one idea which says that multiple senses are used for making meaning of speech. And so when we whisper, we actually do not produce a sound. And so by just looking at the vocal tract, there is something called a motor theory which says that how do we perceive speech? We perceive speech by looking at the vocal tract. And so once we are whispering, we are actually using the same vocal tracts. We are using the same amount of muscles in the vocal tract to produce speech. And so maybe what you are looking at is, or what you are questioning is, how do people perceive speech? So yes, whispering itself, how do people make meaning out of whispering is because speech itself is not needed. The motor theory says that speech itself is not needed for exactly identifying what is being said or making meaning of what is being said. By just looking at, so while we are whispering, the same vocal cords are vibrating, the same vocal apparatus is vibrating, and by just looking at that, the motor act of that, we can have meaning out of it. Computer science and electronics important for research in psychology of language. Psychology of language, you have to have knowledge about linguistics, and if you are looking at psychology of language, you should have a little bit of knowledge about the psychology, because if you are coming from approaching language not from the linguistic point of view but from the psychological point of view, you should have some knowledge of psychology. Now electronics and computer science, I don't think that's needed. People from computer science and electronics, they develop things in language, but that's not necessary, because I have an associated student who is a linguist, and she is working on factor and psychology of language, or she is looking at something called code switching. So how do people switch between different, so bilinguals, how do they switch between different languages? And so she is a linguist and she is working with me, we are doing pretty fine. We are looking at something called switching costs. So when we are moving from one language to the second language, so I tell you something in English, and so if you are bilingual, let's say you know English and Hindi again, so what is switch cost? So basically if I tell you something in English and you have to respond in Hindi, how much time is taken, or what kind of costs are there in switching from them? Because as I said, when I say something to you in English, both the English and Hindi, since you are bilingual, both the Hindi and English concepts or lemmas will be activated. Now what are lemmas? Lemmas are the basic words. So words which are in the purest form. For example, run is a lemma, running, runner, runs, and all those things are something called lexeme, which are the extensions of this word. So basically the basic lemma or basic word is activated, or basic concept is activated in both the forms. If I give you a word in English. Now what we are trying to see is the switching between these two languages, forward switching versus a backward switching, and whether context has an effect or whether timing has an effect, and that kind of thing is what we are looking at. And we are also looking at something called brain related measures, or brain related potential changes in this kind of a switching, and how this switching cost has anything to do with the comprehension of language in the association cortex, the superior temporal lobe. So that's what the interesting thing is. So I don't think you need to have a computer science and electronics is mandatory to have that, but just by having a linguistic perspective or a psychological perspective, you can understand language. But if you do have these, then this is an added advantage. Those listening to music improve the comprehension ability to learn a new language. Now, popularly speaking, it's believed that listening to music improves your performance on any task, any kind of task, whether it is language learning or memory or something like that. And so the idea is that when you listen to music, you do not have to focus onto it. What does music actually do is it activates the arousal system of the body, and so when the body is a little bit aroused, it is more receptive to new systems or new knowledge, and that is what the effect of music is all about. So music, whether it is rock music or it is Beethoven, classical music, it activates, it changes the homeostasis of the body or the arousal level of your body, and you become more receptive to newer things or newer learnings. And so music does definitely improve your language learning skill or memory skill or attentional ability. I am not sure with, but problem solving ability and decision making. So there are some research which says that music does affect improve your comprehension and learning. So that's what it is. And so as I said, this has to do with the arousal. So more aroused you are, the more receptors are open. The more receptors are open, which means that more information can flood in, and more information can flood in has more comprehension power. So yes, music improves the comprehensive ability. Role of dopamine in learning new concept. Okay, so of course there will be the role of dopamine in learning a new concept. So dopamine creates the chance to form new connections in the brain, and so the dopaminergic system forms new memories. Mainly dopamine is related to forming new memories, and so concept learning has to do with learning of new memories. And so when there is an influx of dopamine or there is an increase in dopamine, this leads to formations of new association networks in the brain, and these association networks will lead you to form new memories, and these new memories are of the new concepts. So definitely by this argument, dopamine will lead to learning of new concepts, because the concepts is generally stored in the mental lexicon, and this storage of concepts is in terms of memory. So directly I'd agree to you saying that dopamine increases this memory formation or memory reorganization, and it can help in learning of new concepts. So if you have more questions, I'm here to answer them. And some of the questions which I have not been able to handle now is I'll definitely answer these questions back into the forum. If you have more interesting questions for me, please put up in the forum. We go to the forum every day. That's one of the things that we keep on doing, and we'll come back to you. So there is compulsion of some people to murmur or repeat same words. I'm trying to speak as loud as possible. Arrow GP Gaming, I can speak to my team here and let you know whether it's audible or not. And so what they say is I'm perfectly audible. So I don't know the solution to this right now. So where there is a compulsion of some people to murmur or repeat same words, yes, but that's not to do with language here. That's a disorder which is called obsessive compulsive disorder in psychology. And see, these murmuring is basically a satisfaction. It's a lowering of anxiety which happens. So it has nothing to do with language learning as such, something which I wouldn't be commenting so surely about that, but from my perspective, it has to do with the obsessive compulsiveness that people have, and so this murmuring has to do with that. So, hello Raj, Prince, thank you, Jayendra. I'm trying to speak aloud. And UPSC 128, linguistic is the study of language, how language is formed, what is the use of language, what is the meaning of language for that matter, and how language is different from the communication, what kind of psychological process go into language, and those kind of things are what is linguistic is all about. More about obsessive compulsive disorder in psychology. Now we're going off route somewhere. I'll answer this question of yours in the forum. It's to do with lowering of anxiety. So some people have these ideas of they are anxious and they tend to repeat certain acts again and again because they believe or they have this anxiety that the act that they have done, they are not very sure of it. And so obsession compulsion had two parts in it. The first part is the obsession, which is doing an act again and again, and compulsion is the reason why they do it. And so the two parts, they arrange together. For example, you might have seen people checking their doors after locking again and again. This is an obsession. They have these anxieties and they cannot get away with this anxiety. But there is a very easy way to get rid of this obsession, and that is tagging it with a neutral stimulus. And so what you can do is you can tag the fact that if you have an obsession of locking the door and checking a door which is locked again and again, what you can do is you can relate the number 8. So whenever the number 8 comes to your mind, whenever you see the number 8 anywhere, you will think about that you have locked the door, and that will lessen the obsession which is there. And so there is one technique which is obviously obsessive compulsive disorder is a disorder which has to be treated, but it has to do with this repetitive form of a behavior because of certain anxieties. I am trying to increase my microphone. Bhavesh. So let me talk to them. What is happening? It's perfect. So my team says it is perfect. So we do have another session sometime in the next week, right? If this is a problem and this is a continuing problem, what will happen is they will not be able to hear, because most of them have this question saying that they are not able to hear. Should we end it here and then do it again tomorrow? Because if there is a problem, we cannot fix it right now. Not tomorrow, but next session. So what I have is what is morphology and phonology. So yes, I'll answer that question. What phonology is basic speech sounds. So the human vocal cord produces some basic speech sounds. For example, a, u, e that you learn is the basic speech sound, and morphology is connecting the speech sound to form basic words. For example, or sentence markers. For example, when you say run and runs, the s that comes in the end, or play and played, the ed which comes after that, this is called morphology. So phonology is the basic speech sound that is produced, and these speech sounds are 44. It's the basic vowels and consonants comprising together, and so when they are linked together, they form the these speech sounds, they combine together to form a kind of a continuous speech stream. And morphology is taking the speech sound and getting to the next higher level. So the basic speech sound that you have, they will not give you any meaning as such, but when these speech sounds are combined together, they form the very primitive form of a word or meaningful concept, and that is what morphology is. As I said, one of the things in morphology is ed. So add ed into any sentence and becomes a past tense, or pronouns, forming pronouns. This is what morphology is all about. So that is what the phonology and morphology is all about, and morphology then combines together to form something called words. So you have the study of speech sound is phonology, the study of how speech sounds are combined together to form some kind of meaningful concept is morphology, and this morphology then they combine together, more complex words are combined together to form something called words. These words are combined together to form sentences, and these sentences are arranged in some kind of a rule which is called syntax, and this syntax takes these rules which are called grammar to form some kind of a meaning or some kind of a communication or some kind of an idea being expressed. So that's how the thing goes about. So my video in the headphone is what exactly the team here is doing. What I'll suggest is I'll sign off today, because since you have been complaining about the video and the sound, let me go back to the technical team and ask them to take care of this volume problem, and because my team here says that they are perfectly able to hear this. We will meet again in another session which is to be in maybe in this month or the next month, and I hope that we have more lively session and a more louder session by all means, and let's do that. So for now what I'll say is thank you and goodbye. We'll meet again in the next session with much better technical support and a more louder voice. If you still have questions, please put it onto the forum. I'll answer all your questions. So for now, from here, it is thank you and goodbye.